What's up, guys? It's Rowan.
It's Terry.
Here from Artist Smart TV, bringing you another episode of the
HSC Economics Review.
Now, it's been a little while since we've been on, Terry. It's great to have Terry back. Terry is guest appearing today. Super grateful to have Terry's insight on today's episode. Now, this is a big episode, Terry.
Huge.
I think it's like the episode of the year.
It is generally our biggest, most watched episode, I believe, Ron.
For sure. I mean, I've been getting emails from students, messages on social media, on YouTube, everywhere saying, when are you bringing out your predictions video? And so, yes, this is it. It's finally here, our HSC Economics predictions video. Now, really quickly, why do you want to listen to our predictions, right? Well, at the end of the day, we're just two guys that love economics. In saying that, we have been making predictions now for over 10 years. On average, we get 2 out of 4 shorts and 2 out of 4 essays right. Now, last year, just to give you a bit of context, we got 3 out of 4 short answer questions right. We got 2 essays, if I'm being really probably 1.5 essays. We got the issues right, but we didn't quite we picked a singular policy rather than a macro policy question with the issues. So 1.5, let's call it, right? So in other words, a pretty good track record. That was just last year, but if we zoom out across the time period of the last decade or so, it's a pretty 50-50 sort of chance that we're getting them right. Now, in saying that, we could get them wrong. So, at the end of the day, our hope is in this video, you'll find this helpful in, being a little bit more strategic maybe on areas of the course that you decide to prioritize, and maybe spend a bit more time, particularly if you haven't already. At the end of the day, though, what we don't want to see you guys do is just rely on this video only and go, great, I'm not going to do any other study in all the other areas, and then go in and then we get it wrong and you're coming out going, I absolutely flopped in economics. So that's just the disclaimer that I want to share at the start. Do you have anything
I want to add a little bit to that just in terms of the disclaimer. I think it's important to not just hear what Rowan and I are saying, but also just pay attention to what your teachers have been saying at school as well, because for the most part, your teachers have probably been doing this for a very, very long time. And so while Rowan and I have just looked at a few kind of trends and patterns that we've started to see emerge as well, like your teachers themselves might also have slightly different opinions and slightly different rationale. So I think what's always important, as with any kind of good economist would say, is that you don't just look at one data set or you don't just look at one opinion or perspective, you look at it holistically. So take what Rowan and I say, take what your teacher says, and go with your own intuition a little bit as well. And if you combine all those things together, I think you should then start to see a little bit more of a holistic, balanced prediction of what might pop up on your exam,
and therefore what you should prep for. So with that disclaimer sort of done, right? I think let's get into the meat, which is why you're here. Which is great. What are the predictions? What do we think is likely to appear in this exam? Now, note, we'll start with shorts. We'll then move our way to essays. And Terry and I, we don't agree on everything, right? There are some parts we agree, but there are definitely some parts we disagree on. And I think this goes to Terry's point that your teacher probably may have some other opinions as well, right? And so let us know in the comments afterwards, number one, where we disagree, are you team Terry, are you team Rowan? Who do you agree with?
Always team Terry, but but it is what it is.
Depending on the rationale, right? But also, you might disagree with stuff that we both agree on because your teacher or your own analysis indicates something different. Yeah. And we'd love to hear that, right? Yeah. We'd love to hear that insight. So drop that in the comments as well. If you think, hey, actually there's something that we've missed and there's something that you think is going to be there, and let us know why you think so as well.
I think it's important as well because then that drives other people to comment alongside, and that can actually create a really nice conversation. So people who aren't necessarily commenting might actually realize and go, oh, actually I didn't even think about that, and that might actually prompt them to go and spend a bit more time looking at something that they'd previously kind of neglected. So it's really, really useful. So just drop your opinions. I think it's really useful, not just for yourself, but for everybody watching the video.
And that's the point. We're trying to help, hopefully, you guys in your prep. And so, pay the favour forward and helping another eco student if you've got a different opinion, right, as well.
Love that.
So, let's dive in. Terry, do you want to kick us off? Because I think the first one, we've got a bit of a disagreement. We're just going to get straight into the disagreement,
we're just going to butt heads just right from the get-go. So my first short answer that I'm kind of riding with is labour markets. Now, something really quite interesting is that oftentimes when we do our analysis, we often try to attach it to one particular syllabus area, one topic. But what the HSC, I think, is trying to do increasingly more often is trying to blend it a little bit more. So it's not just really 10 marks on just one small part. That there's a bit of bleed. I call it over, like it bleeds over a little bit.
Or a remix, basically. Right?
Remix, okay. Yeah, that's some heavy stuff. But I think I think my first pick for the first short answer is labour markets, which is different from what Rowan had. So Rowan's going to tell you in a sec what he had. But my reasons for labour markets is that, first of all, it was done last year. However, as someone who's been in this game for a while, I know labour markets is very, very it's a section that a lot of students underperform in. And a typical thing that exam writers will do is take a section of the course, or take a section of last year's exam that wasn't done well, and kind of remix it, as Rowan was saying, and put it as another question the next year. So I think, even though it was done last year, looking at that exam a little bit more closely, 5 marks of it was actually on microeconomic reform and how it reduces unemployment, which isn't really specifically labour market. So in a way, I look at it and go, well, they've only really tested labour markets 5 marks in last year's exam. So there's definitely space for them to do a lot more with it. I think perhaps this time there might be a bit of an unemployment focus with it, just attaching it to unemployment. But if they don't do that, I think unemployment will then be its own section. But I just think that unemployment will probably be there somewhere. What I will mention is that, before I get to Ron's topic, I've actually deviated quite heavily here, because he's playing the numbers, so to speak. He's looked at it and gone, oh yeah, 10 out of 11. So 10 out of 11 exams of the past exams have had this topic. I've said, you know what, for some reason, they're just not going to do it this year. So I might hand it over to Ron. What is that topic?
Cool. What I'll say, though, is with labour markets, just to add a little point here, in that there's also been an awful lot that's happened in 2020 to 24 in terms of just industrial relations changes, right? So there's been a lot flowing through, and so in many respects, I think, given the amount that's happened, there's also not necessarily been a lot of examination on it, to Terry's point, right? So even though I've got a different topic here, I can see very much why, there's some strong rationale for it, it could reappear.
Thanks for agreeing with me.
Yep. So the topic that I've picked is environment, right? And so to Terry's point, that's exactly it. In the last 10 out of 11 years, environment has appeared at some part of the paper, right? Either in shorts or in essays. And so what you're going to notice is there's different strategies we might use in picking our predictions, right? Sometimes it's looking at the prior year's paper, what was tested well, what was tested poorly. In other times, we're looking at a bit of like a trends analysis in terms of like how often, something has appeared and whether it'll appear again. And so I've sort of gone with that analysis here, because at the end of the day, it appeared as an essay last year. It hasn't appeared, it's never appeared actually as an essay 2 years running, okay? It has appeared as a short answer question though 2 years running, but not as an essay. So given it was an essay last year, I don't think it's going to appear as an essay this year. The Catholic paper this year did think it, maybe, and they've sort of hedged their bets, right, by adding it as part of more of like a case study question, which was, I think, a really neat little spin on it. But ultimately, I think on the basis that it's appeared 10 out of 11 years, it was a short answer in 22, 21, right? Given it was an essay last year, I'm sort of going for a pick this year to say environment. Now, I also didn't predict environment last year, and then it was in the paper, despite these trends. So this year, doing the opposite, so let's see if we get it right. But this is just based on the fact that I think it's very, very common. Now, the other thing I would add to this, and I don't know to what extent this plays in, but this year they've been working on a new syllabus for the economics course, okay, that will be implemented from 2026. And a draft syllabus did come out. And in that syllabus, they've basically identified that they're elevating the environment, because in many respects, it's sort of almost like a secondary economic issue in the current course, right? Like you've got your big three, typically in the past of inflation, unemployment, economic growth, and then, there's environment. And so it's being elevated in its importance in the new course. And so, not to say that's being considered in this paper, but I think it just reflects the changing sort of mindset that, we have around the role of environment in the economics course, which is why I think it's become such a staple of the prior exams, and why I suspect it might be here somewhere.
Yeah, I agree definitely on that kind of increasing role of the environment. However, I think, Rowan, you're just a year early. I think where I'm kind of placing the timing of this is that I think 100% if it's going to become a much more prominent part of the syllabus, and keep in mind it is just a draft at the end of the day. We don't know whether a lot of those changes are actually going to get implemented.
That's right.
But if it does go through, I think I'm probably more, thinking with my teacher hat on. If I'm a teacher, I'd go, well, I'd probably want to see that specimen paper first of that new syllabus, where I'm going to be adding a lot of those newer questions that test that kind of new knowledge that we're putting into the syllabus. So I think maybe perhaps...
I guess what I'm saying though is I think it's more just a reflection of the fact that it's become more important.
I agree with you. I understand, I understand completely.
Cool.
But I just think maybe it might come a little bit later. The only other thing I just wanted to add about the labour markets was that I think Rowan spoke about the thing about labour markets. I also feel the same way about the environment on the other end, in that he was saying that there were some really interesting things going on in terms of developments in labour markets, but whereas I thought some of the developments in terms of things like targets getting updated and renewed in terms of the environment were potentially not really, in my eyes, short answer question material, which is one of the reasons why I decided to kind of split apart and go labour markets.
Yeah, and I think that that could be a really good point. I mean, look, I suspect there is still plenty of room with like externalities and in terms of a short answer if you were to put it in there and then still have a 5-marker. But I think that's exactly it. Like you've got to think about, and that's what we certainly try to do here, is to think about the fact that what are the types of questions that you get in the short answers, right? And there's often a mixture of like skills, calculation where possible, as well as you obviously need something that's going to have a 5 or 6 marker to sort of really get your teeth into, and that does influence then, which topics are going to lend themselves better.
I love that.
And I think that probably is a nice segue into the next one that we agree on. So first of all, in the comments, let us know, labour or enviro, or maybe you think both, actually, and you're going to agree with
that would be crazy, combined.
I don't know how that would work. I'm not necessarily saying that you might think both, but just whether or not, which one do you think is more likely? Let us know in the comments. What's the next one, Terry? We both agree on this one.
Yeah, so hopefully this is going to be a much more straightforward conversation. It's just going to be, I think, exchange rates. So I've kind of looked back through, I've done what Rowan did with the environment question. I looked back and I saw that last year it was a short answer question, although it was combined with the balance of payments. It was still part of a big 6 marker though. It was where you're looking at the exchange rate and the effects on the balance of payments. Then we've got short answer in 22, 21, an essay in 2020, short answer in 2019, 18, and 16. So that means it's been featured in everything since 2016 except for 2017. I think it's also been part of the Catholic paper as a short answer and the Independent as an essay. And so I just think such a prominent part, and because almost by process of elimination, I've got something else picked in the essays, spoiler alert, but so I just think it very naturally fits. It will be in the exam, and I just think that it kind of fits more in that short answer question. I think to speak to your point earlier about what's a good kind of question to do, I think I love those questions because there's just so much to talk about in terms of the analysis of the causes and the effects of the exchange rate. I think increasingly they're becoming a bit more adventurous in terms of what they're asking students to do with this part of the course. And you're asked to link the exchange rate to more than just some of those topic 2 areas, but also the wider economy as well.
I also think there's some skill stuff that you can do here as well, right? In terms of just whether or not you're bringing in TWI, whether or not you've got some data that you're wanting students to look at. So again, whether or not they do that, but I think it has a lot of options in how they could approach it.
And I love that because you know why? Because when they do those 10 markers, now we're really getting technical. I don't remember doing it to this level in previous editions of this run, but when they're doing those kind of 1, 2, 3 markers that they need, relatively easy stuff where they're testing a very simple concept. I just think exchange rates has it all. It's got that range of, like, as you're saying, some of those TWI stuff, some of just those basic shifts of curves and things like that. You can smash out a 1 or 2 marker easily, but then you can get your teeth into something that's like a 5 or 6 marker. So I think just in terms of the way that they love to structure the 10 marks, like usually 1, 2, 3 markers followed by a big one. I just think that exchange rates is such an apt choice for short answers.
We're in agreement. Let us know if we've got it wrong. I don't have anything to add. Terry summed it up perfectly, so let's keep moving. But let us know what your thoughts are in the comments. So the next one, we have a bit of a disagreement. In part, I think because I've placed what your topic is in the essays, right? And so it's not a disagreement on the topic
It's just the
appearing,
placement,
it's just
yeah.
the placement. I think that's worth paying attention to from a point of like brushing up in your own study as well. So Terry, what did you have here for your one?
Yeah, I had unemployment. And so, again, just some of the reasons why. So it featured in both the Independent and the Catholic paper as a short answer question. I also just, again, think it's one of those questions where it's good to assess because like we spoke about, the easier ones and then the tough
You've got plenty of
questions.
calculation stuff in, calculating
types,
definitions, part of it, right?
Brief explanation. I think there's some really interesting stuff they've done in recent years about the relationship between unemployment, underemployment, and casualisation and things like that. I think it's just really
and you could even, if they're going to
fascinating.
jam stuff together, right, which, as we're saying is a theme that happens in these, you could easily jam unemployment with, a conflict of objectives, right? As the 5 or 6 marker, right?
I love that.
I
love that.
That's, I think, quite plausible even, right?
Yeah.
Given the challenges in the economy that we've had, right? Which is, okay, how do we get inflation down without causing unemployment to go up?
Absolutely, because I think a couple of years back they also had a question with the environment where it was saying, how can you achieve environmental sustainability? So they actually do love that kind of interplay between let's focus on one objective but see how it kind of pairs off with the other objectives in terms of its conflicts. I also just think, so to speak topically, I think unemployment has started to kind of inch up again as well. So there are some challenges there that they might be interested in assessing. And again, I think for me, it's one of those what I call token topic 3 questions in the sense that because they're just so accessible, those calculations, right? Like they love to. First of all, there's usually always a topic 3. Like in case you haven't picked up the theme, there's one question per topic in the shorts, and so for me, it's that kind of token topic 3 representation because it's kind of had its not really had its turn in the spotlight, so it's having a go around the rotation. So I think unemployment for me is definitely a good pick here. But what did you have?
So I think this one's maybe a little of a higher risk, and I'm mindful of that. But I do have some rationale for it, right? So I'm just going to qualify that. So I suspect that this question, I'm going with a remix. I'm trying to look at the fact that they are jamming things together, and so I think an inflation and monetary policy sort of combo is what I would be picking. Now, why? Well, I'll start with monetary and then I'll highlight inflation. So in part, what this highlights is I'm not picking monetary for an essay, right? So I've made a decision based on looking at the data that I don't think there's going to be a macro essay this year. Now, why? Well, very briefly, there was one in 2023. And so I think it's more likely that they're looking at maybe a split in fiscal and monetary. Now, we'll talk more about that later when we get to essays, but generally they haven't had 2 macro essays back-to-back since 2017 and 18. So it does happen, but it hasn't happened for a little while, okay? The trend tends to be that when there's a macro essay, the next year they tend to split up the policies, right, in terms of fiscal and monetary. Now, again, this is just on trends, that can always change. Past doesn't always necessarily indicate future. So one of the things, though, that I would say then is, okay, if they're going to split it, it's also not that common. They don't do it often where they split both of them and give in the next year both the fiscal and monetary, right? It has happened before, okay? But often, it will be one or the other. Now, monetary policy hasn't been assessed since 2019 as a short answer question. So it's been a little while since it's appeared there, while fiscal policy was a short answer question in 2022. So if I believe that they're going to split, they're not going to do a macro in essays, then it's a question of which one do I think is more likely to appear in the shorts. And just based on that analysis, I've went towards monetary policy. Now, I think there's some counterpoints to that. Like there's been a lot going on with monetary policy, review of the RBA, right? Elevating full employment, to like one of their core objectives alongside inflation. So there are a lot of things that have been happening this year. Obviously, a bit of the ongoing sort of criticism around their contractionary stance. So there's stuff that have happened this year that could make it very topical as part of an essay, right? I'm very mindful of that. In saying that, I've still lent towards the fact that I think it'll appear here as a short answer. Now, I think it also lends itself well in some ways to short answer questions. There's some things that you can do with it, okay? Maybe not quite as well as some of the other topics in terms of like skills-based calculation stuff, where I think is a little bit of a limitation, which is why I suspect they could really combine it with inflation. So, inflation was last tested as a short answer question in 2021, 2015 and 2012. So it doesn't appear as a short answer, surprisingly all that much, despite the fact that You could do CPI calculation stuff. You could integrate it with economic growth. There's a lot of places you could take it. It doesn't appear that often, and it's almost like a 3 or 4 year sort of cadence that it's appearing in short answer, which makes 2024 a potential year if we just look at the cadence. It's pretty undertested as short answer. It was an essay last year. It's a major issue at present, okay, which lends itself, as well. So I think, there could be some inflation questions, some calc, and then it culminates with a monetary policy question as the 5 or 6 marker. I'm being obviously quite specific here, so I could also completely be well off the mark.
yeah. So if I could speak a bit more as well to what you were saying, Rowan. So I think definitely there's a lot of merit to what you've just said. I think if they were going to be even more kind of brave and even just get rid of inflation altogether, I think an area where they could get a bit of those calculation questions as well, like I've seen, is where they give you a bit of data and you've got to then kind of make up like hypothetical data, and you've got to then kind of make up your own mind about what stance monetary policy could take. So what I just wanted to kind of add to yours was that potentially they could even do a full 10.
There's enough on that.
Yeah, there is certainly enough, as you've said, because it's so kind of inconsistently examined and quite under-tested. There is actually scope for it to be a full 10, really, on monetary policy.
And one of the things I'd say is if you're going to do your prep for monetary, I also think it's worth getting a good statement under your belt for an explanation of how monetary policy is now implemented with the corridor.
Yeah.
And the reason I say this is even though I know some schools are still not teaching this to students from, working and supporting students, I think the RBA have been out there educating for quite some time now, for a lot of years. Hey, we use a corridor to do this thing, right? And so I suspect that we're maybe at a point where, examiners are like, well, okay, it's hopefully, the transmission of this concept is, should be...
The time lag.
Yeah, exactly, right? The time lag we should have dealt with that now. And so it's something that hasn't been assessed, but, in older HSC papers, it was, right? It was a question that was asked often around, how does the RBA implement monetary policy? And so I think that's just why I also thought, we haven't really had that yet.
Yeah.
When is it going to come?
I think in previous renditions of this, we've also spoken about it as well. We've said, at some point they have to. I think we've been harping on it about for at least a couple of
2 years
now.
at least.
Yeah. So I just think, maybe you're right. Like at this point, you can't shy away from it forever.
So I think just if you're going to cover yourself, have something there is what I would be saying. Right?
That's true. Because I think also students can actually still be quite confused about it, because they'll write brilliant things in their essays about what the RBA is doing and where they're going in terms of the decisions, but how they actually even implement decisions.
Yeah,
it's
I agree. It's usually exactly right. So let's keep moving. So that's a bit of a difference for Terry and I think in both cases there's some good rationale, right? So let us know again. What do you think? Unemployment. Although note, I think we both agree it's going to be in the paper somewhere. Do you think monetary or inflation? Let us know in the comments. Now let's get to the final short answer question. I think we almost agree here. There's an overlap.
Yeah,
but there's some difference, right? So jump in. You lead the way, Terry.
Yeah. So I think I called it the token topic 3 question above, but I also call this the miscellaneous topic 1 question, because I just think of all the topics, this one is always the one that's the most kind of disjointed. We've spoken at length today, Rowan, about the concepts of what goes into 10 marks in terms of assessment. I find that with topic 1, it's always it can almost just feel like a mismatch. You'll have something about government forums, then you have something about free trade, and then you'll wrap it up with something about your case study.
Yeah, it's almost like they try to look at the areas and go, we'll pick that and that, right?
Yeah, like they're throwing darts at the syllabus and just going, yeah, we'll do those ones. So I'm just gonna. I think at this point I'm tired of just kind of picking something specific, and I'm just gonna do what they do. Really, I'm just gonna pick a few things and you go for it. So first of all, why have I gone with topic 1? Because as I said, process of elimination, you need to have something
from each of the topics.
From each topic. So I've said it features a bit of a mash of globalization and protection type questions. I personally think, though, that case study was an essay last year. It's pretty much never been repeated as an essay, but I still do feel like there's been a bit of an uptick in terms of what they've been doing. I think it was a short a couple of years back as well. Then it featured as an essay after we'd spoken, I think, for about 2-3 years about wanting it to be an essay. Then it finally
was
that's
the
an
one
essay.
we actually was one of the ones we predicted last year.
We were the guys that cried wolf.
We've been saying it every year, so eventually, a broken clock is eventually right at least twice a day, right? So anyway,
right.
But we did get it last year.
We did get it. But yeah, I just think maybe they might not be done with their case study, so they might. I think there's good scope to kind of chuck it in there as a miscellaneous short question.
I would agree with the aspect, because I have some comments I'll share in a moment separately, but I would just say that I think particularly post-COVID, right, there's been a lot of changes globally, and certainly how economies are thinking about their relationship with the global economy. So I do think it's also why it's again making a bit of a resurgence, right? Because there's more to talk about. There's been more updates in how countries other than Australia, in Australia included, are approaching their relationship with the globe in terms of their policy settings.
Yeah, no, I love that, because I think what you can do is specify even in recent trends, and they have done that in the short answer a couple of years back about recent trends in the globe on Australia's industries. But it's a bit mean to, I think, do that as a whole 20 marker. But then you certainly can go ahead and do that as a 5 marker, right? Recent trends in globalization. But I echo similar sentiments to what you're saying there, Rowan. I think the emphasis that last year the essay was actually on globalization. It was to look at the effects of globalization on a country other than Australia. I think potentially if they want to go there again, but tweak it a little bit, they might just focus a bit more on that kind of protection side of things. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. So I think overall,
particularly given the decoupling, in terms of how countries are, Australia included, right, are looking at how do we essentially secure critical supply chain. And so I agree, that could be an interesting combo, right?
Yeah. Certainly. So overall, I'm kind of putting together just kind of 2 areas here: case study and protection. The last thing about protection, so we've spoken about what's kind of happening in terms of what countries are choosing to do these days. But I also think that protection as a concept has often been tested in multiple choice. It was a bit of a cliche almost for the past kind of 10 years.
Yeah, because it's great. Throw a quota or a tariff diagram at you, and
they couldn't get enough of it. In fact, they were doing 2-part questions where you had 2 multis on a diagram. So I think, thankfully, in my eyes, we've moved away from that, because it was getting so dry. It was just. And it was, in one year they even had an issue with the actual answer of the question. So I think, thankfully, we're moving away from it. But I think maybe potentially you could also throw it in that kind of short answer section. So I've got case study and protection as my miscellaneous topic 1.
And so I think where we agree, certainly I think the protection side of things. Now, I think protection is going to appear somewhere in the paper, and I was actually quite torn between a short or an essay, because I think there's actually some rationale on either side for it. I'm not sure about the case study. I think, obviously it could be an environment, because, we saw in the Catholic, they thought maybe there's an opportunity to look at the case study through environment. It could be through protection, as Terry's highlighted. I suspect, though, you should be dusting off your notes on protection and free trade, because if it's not a short, I think there's some room for essay. So why do I think, protection, free trade in this question? Well, there was a global trade question in the short answer questions last year. But honestly, it was more about the WTO, why we trade, and the impact of trade on global distribution of income. So there was a question, but it didn't focus that much on protection. It was more actually a little bit on the free trade, why do we trade, right? So my point is, even though there was a question there, I think there's plenty of areas to focus on. And there's also a bunch of skills and calculation stuff. If they wanted to move that from the multis, there's plenty of options in what they could bring into the shorts, right? So I think there's plenty of opportunity there. Now, from 2020 to 2023, there has been some form of protection question in SAQs, right, in the short answer question. So it appears pretty consistently. The Catholic paper, did have an essay question, and it was a great essay question. If you're looking for an essay question to just absolutely get massive coverage over free trade protection and its impact on Australia, it's a great question. It was the impact of domestic protection and free trade policies on the Australian economy, right? So there's a good question there. So in the end, I was like, look, I feel like it could appear as an essay, and there's some more commentary we'll have there. But in the end, I thought, it feels like it's slightly more likely to be here as a short answer question. And so I think you should be, as I said, you should be dusting off your notes on it and getting your head around it regardless. But yeah, I think, likely here. And maybe the only point of difference is maybe it doesn't have the case study.
Yeah. So I also just agree with Rowan there. I think you certainly need to kind of dust off your notes with regard to your free trade protection, because for a lot of students it was something they covered about 12 months ago, and I think it's just very useful to have that knowledge, because you do forget things.
Yeah. Now, one little final, and this was just one that was just like a little, like an unusual one that I thought I'd just throw in there, which was just for another short answer question. And it probably, if anything, there might be an integration here, because we were talking about how they like doing stuff sometimes with exchange rates as well. Or, was economic growth has not been asked since 2016 as a short answer question. It has featured a lot in essays, right, as part of essays. There's a bunch of calculation opportunity stuff that you can do here. Again, often they've been doing some of this in the multis, but they can choose to move it around. And it does often pair quite well. Like, you could do it with Enviro. It could be like the conflict between environmental sustainability and economic growth. For example, you could mix it with, exchange rates, even with free trade and protection, the impact. So it's just one that I think outside of essays has actually been a little under-tested. It's one that we identified last year as well. Like, hey, it hasn't really come across in shorts that much. And so I'm just going to throw that out there. I don't have like a strong opinion about that one. It was just an interesting one that I was like, you know what, I'll share it, just because, I think it's a very flexible topic that doesn't get looked at in shorts that often. I don't know if you want to add anything, or we just move to essays.
Yeah, no, I think definitely brush up on your economic growth, because it'll be either in, as Ron was saying, it'll be in the multis, shorts, or as an essay. So it's going to be there.
So now let's dive into essays. Okay, let's get into our essays, and once again here, we've got some areas of agreement. I think we've got 2 areas of agreement, 1 area of partial agreement, and 1 area of disagreement. So there's a whole mixed bag here. So let's dive into our first essay, where we've got some partial agreement. I actually suspect it's more agreement than we think. But let's find out. What did you pick for this one, Terry?
So first one I have is, I've got CAD with external stability. So do notice I have said the word CAD, because if the news hasn't reached you, we are officially back in a current account deficit. So first of all, featured in both the Catholic and the independent papers as essays. So very interesting. So they've definitely gone down that path as well. And as I said, of interest certainly because the current account has moved back from its surplus since 2019 to now a deficit in 2024. I think there's just, if you look at that a little deeper, there's some really interesting global trends going on in terms of things like commodity prices, interest rates, and inflation that have all had really quite significant impacts, not only on Australia, but also, not just on Australia's balance of payments, but also on our external stability as a whole. So I think some of those things that were occurring kind of during COVID or even post-COVID are now trying to start to reverse. So I think there can be some very interesting kind of analysis or discussion that goes on here. So I don't really think they're going to necessarily ask you to evaluate. So another new thing that we're kind of bringing in is what kind of verbs and directions are they going to go with? So I don't really think it's something which it would be quite a big task to ask students to kind of evaluate or assess, but I think it's certainly something where some great discuss or analyze could be done with. In terms of just some other reasons, I think topic 2 usually pretty much always features as an essay topic. I've seen it every year since 2017. Last year they did composition, value, and direction of trade. Unlikely to kind of repeat that again.
And the year before they did BOP and AUD. Yeah. So it's I think it's why it's probably not. I think it's why we've sort of said, hey, exchange rate's probably more likely to appear in the shorts, right? At least in a specific focus. Yeah. So
I think overall, as Rowan said, we do agree, but I think where we kind of differ a little bit is just the extent of the focus on external stability. So I've got CAD with external stability. I think Rowan, you've got.
Yeah, so my take is, external stability has been around, pretty much at some level. I mean, as Terry's highlighted, it's been assessed in essays over the last 4 or 5 years, but never in its own entirety. So it's usually they pair it with something else. So that's, I think, partly probably what's also informed Terry's perspective on let's pair it with, it's been paired with exchange rates in the past. It's been paired with, policy, right? So I can see very much Terry's thinking of okay, look, it's very rarely in and of itself only, it's with something else. My take is, well, on the flip side, that also indicates that it's been under-tested as a singular focus, right? Now, what I think is interesting about this is that, when you test external stability, you are ultimately also getting a lot of other topic coverage. because two of the measures of external stability are the current account and the value of the Australian dollar, right? The third is, net foreign liabilities as a percentage of GDP. So, in other words, just by having external stability focus, you are actually bringing in a lot of the AUD balance of payments, current account components, regardless, right? So I think there's that. I think the reason I think there may be a bigger focus on external stability is because we've seen such a significant shift in the size of our net foreign liabilities as a percentage of GDP over the last couple of years, number one, right? Like, it's almost halved, right?
Yep.
Significant, right? Hasn't really been assessed yet. There's not really been a question that's really, dug into that at all. Equally, we've become, up until recently, right, we've been a net capital exporter. There's a lot of interesting reasons why we're a net capital exporter. Again, haven't felt like it's really been dug into, and I can understand why you wouldn't do it the first year, right? But there's been a couple of years now that this has been the case, like arguably almost 4. So I feel like we're at this point where there's some of these areas that just have not been really assessed. Now, if you go back and look at older questions that either were in the shorts or in external stability, when we were, current account deficits and external stability wasn't that great, and these were some of the things that they did look at. So it's almost like, well, they looked at it in the past, they haven't looked at it yet, which is why I think, okay, it could be possible. Now, the Catholic paper had one, but they did the same sort of trend as what Terry's, that is, they've connected it to something else, which has been the trend in the papers. So they connected it to trade and financial flows, which makes sense because at the end of the day, they're the big drivers, right? The things that are going to influence our current account, our net foreign liabilities and our value of our dollar. In saying that, for me, that felt too similar to the 2023 essay question, right? Trade value, yes, it didn't have financial flows, but it's like a lot of overlap with the trade flow component. So that's why I've sort of opted for maybe something that is a little more external stability focused. I'm taking a slightly bigger risk. I would say, the sort of less risky approach is to go, hey, external stability will be paired with something else, because that's what the trends say. I'm going to go a little bit more risky here and say I think that there's going to be a bigger focus on it singularly. And I think they could give you a question that's like causes and effects of fluctuations in Australia's external stability. Right? It's a pretty hard one.
So there's a lot to write about.
There's a lot to write about there in terms of like, okay, causes, well, what's the changes? And then, okay, what's some of the effects of that? And so that's a quite challenging one. I'm very mindful of that. Yeah. So yes, right? You might be freaking out right now as you hear that and you're like, I'm going to avoid that question if it comes in, and that's fair enough. But yeah, I'm going with something a little more risky as my pick.
So I'm grateful that you said you are very mindful of that, because I'm very demure of the fact that essentially one thing which Bro and I think we've kind of subtly hinted at, but we didn't really explicitly talk about, was that we've got this as the first essay. And as you know, that when in terms of the structure of the exam, you've got 2 essays first which give you stimulus, and then 2 essays that have no stimulus. I think we're both in agreement, just double checking here, that this would be one of those questions that
they would 100% give you stimulus.
Yeah, especially for your question.
I don't think they could give you this question and not give you the stimulus and expect to have decent responses.
And to that credit, I think they'd give you a lot of stimulus too, because I think they varied it up. I think last year there wasn't an awful lot of stimulus in terms of what they gave you, but I think if we were to tackle an external stability focused essay question, I think you definitely need to have something that comments about the size of the net foreign liability account, something that comments on where the exchange rate has moved.
And there's some great RBA stuff that I think you could see them putting in there, where like there's one where there's an RBA and there's an article. If you haven't seen it and you're wanting to prep for this, I'd recommend get your head around it. There's a great article where the RBA is basically explaining why have our NFL fallen so much.
I've seen that one too.
And it's a great explainer, but like I look at that and I'm like, yeah, that's exactly like pulling a little something out of that as like a stimulus. Perfect, right? Because even if you're not sure where to go, it would give you great, I know where I've got to take this now, right?
Honestly, just read it. I think you might look at us and go, there's no way I would ever read anything like that, but it is a very good read, very very colourful, a lot of nice graphs, and a very clear message about, and it's very succinct about exactly why the NFL has halved.
Yeah, it is like fantastic. So particularly if you want to cover yourself, even if it's not only on external stability and there's a bit of a current account deficit, like you're still going to need it at some level.
And then you read it and it pops up in your HSC exam as part of the stimulus.
That would be pretty cool. Let's see if we get there.
Yeah,
right. That would be pretty amazing. That's a crazy level of prediction, then, right?
Predicting we're predicting the stimulus.
Anyway, let's not go there. I think we're going to break our backs on that one. Let's jump into the next one. And I think we had agreement on this one as well. Again, I was a little torn around some things, but let's jump in.
I'll start us off here because I think this was probably I had this idea initially as well, which I've kind of been humming about it for a while, for a few years now, but this globalization and international organizations, like, please just give it to us as an essay. I think it's really sad that it hasn't gotten its time in the spotlight, but I think for me, you know, just looking at one of the underdogs, I really want to support it. But there is above that, there is probably a better reason for this. What I've kind of noticed in the past like 4 or 5 years of the HSC is that every year there's at least one question that, at least me personally, right, I look at and go, there's no way. So, like, I think the first couple of years we were just like, oh yeah, that's a one-off. But now it's happened for a couple of years. There's always just that one essay that you go, there's no way somebody decided to put that as an essay question, but they do. So I'm calling it my little curveball question. So to give you an idea of what I've seen as the curveball, so last year was the composition, value and direction of trade last year, reasons for differences in development in 2022, a whole essay dedicated to trade and assessing trade and financial flows in 2020, which is very difficult because it's not really anything you really do in the course usually.
Yeah, and it's unlikely that a student's going to have that volume of stats and evidence on that narrow topic. Right? Yeah. And
then you also had the you had like almost like a fiscal policy essay that was disguised as a conflict in economic objectives of eco growth and income distribution in 2020. So I think what they've kind of moved ahead with is just this kind of curveball, because I think, to touch back on what Rowan was saying earlier about the new syllabus coming in, as you get towards the end of a syllabus, you start to get these weird things.
Well, what's left? Right? They're just, you know, like, okay, well, we've got to get creative here.
Yeah, so they definitely get, you know, they get the focus groups in, and they get the think tanks, and they get something really weird and wacky going. So my weird and wacky choice for this year is just going to be globalization and international organizations. So yeah, I feel like it's the plus side, though, aside from that 2021 question, is that generally speaking, the verb that they attach to these kind of niche topics is usually quite straightforward.
It's like a discuss.
Yeah, so it's the trade-off. You get the reward, so you pick a bit of a really narrow focus, but you do get a slightly easier verb along with it. So what I do think with your preparation is that if you are a really well-prepared student, I think this is one of those essays where you can really stand out, and what you'll be able to really do is just start to bring in parts of your other revision and knowledge of the course to kind of really open up and broaden those essays, because at first they might look quite narrow, but you know,
there are opportunities for sure.
Lots of opportunities to kind of go hard. So yeah, I just want to see a bit of love for the international orgs.
What I would add, so I agree with Terry on this one. So, I mean, I've felt, this has been so undertested, but I think it was undertested for good reason. In that, during the 2010s, really up until COVID, international orgs had really waned in their global influence, right? You know, partly because it was very evident that their ability to affect change was, becoming quite limited. Yes, the IMF was still having some roles with structural adjustment policies and bailouts. Certainly, 2014, 2015, 2016 periods, right?
Literally because of Trump, but we move.
Yeah. But I think really what happened, with COVID is that, we've seen international orgs, come to like a bit of a renaissance, right? Whether or not that's through, more global consensus on climate change through COP and through the UN, right? Whether or not that's through just the growing role again of the WHO, but the WTO as well, in terms of just, given the sort of some of the trade disputes that have emerged. And so I do think there's just more almost fodder, right, that you could use. And I could see, therefore, the examiners also going, well, this is a narrower topic, but there's actually some interesting things that, students could bring into this. So I think the other final thing would be, just given the decoupling that we've highlighted earlier post-COVID in terms of, just the fact that countries are trying to secure supply chains for critical infrastructure. I think, that also makes it sort of interesting, okay, to what extent, what's happening with globalization. Now, the one final thing that I would add, again, this is just a little bit of seeing the sneak preview of the draft syllabus. And again, this is not this current. So this is just, again, trying to maybe get a sense of some of the thinking that might be starting to happen is, okay, the biggest area of, redraft I noticed in that syllabus was around globalization, right? That it was particularly around this area here, and looking at both hyper-globalization, but also the challenges now in terms of, okay, the issues that we have in, because of that interconnectivity, right, we get these massive supply chain, cracks, and then we get cost-push inflation, and there's these new issues that have emerged, right? So, I think there's a lot that you could sort of say if they wanted to go there.
Yeah. So it almost just sounds like to put a verb to it, because based on what Rowan was saying, it almost seems like he's very heavily leaning towards something like a discuss kind of verb.
100%. I would be very surprised if they would be mean and would do something beyond that. Particularly when I've also been saying, are they going to go harder before, right?
Oh yeah, because that's a really good point as well, because they often try to pair the verbs together.
That's
so that
right.
The questions are fairly...
So exactly, right? So even if one is harder in one area, the other with the verb is the way to offset it. So exactly. So let's go on to the next one, because I think the next one we also had some agreement. We'll save our disagreement for the end, right? The next one we had some agreement. I might jump in
you go first.
because I had a bunch of rationale, and then I think you've got some other things to add in here as well. So I've identified micro policy here. And this sort of is a really nice touch point on just the supply constraint issues we were just talking about, right? Like I think they've been an issue for Australia over the last couple of years. It's not a recent issue. I think it's quite topical. Therefore, it was last tested, excluding a trade, environment, or labour focus. Because we've got to remember they're all like micro as well, but usually they go specific for one of those areas, right? So as a result, it was last tested, in essay, short answer questions in 21 and 2020. It was an essay in 2019, okay? Basically over the last 6 years, it's been examined 4 times, but not in 2022 or 2023, okay? So there's this sense of like, it was pretty common. There's been a gap for a couple of years, right? But it has been probably a bigger issue the last couple of years as well, which makes me think, hey, we've got to be getting it. Like, it's got to be coming soon, okay, as a result. So I think it's overdue, if anything, for a question. There's a lot been happening across trade, competition policy, labour. There's so much that's been happening there across all of that. So if they don't specify, they're also giving, I think, students a lot of opportunity to go, great, like there's a lot of different things you could talk about. And so I think it's just a good question, even though it's a harder topic, and a lot of students, because it's like, often if you do a linear structure, it's one of the last things that you do in the course. It's one that students find pretty dry, so it's not the most well done from a student's point of view, but I think if they leave it broad, it also gives students a lot of options in terms of where they could take it. I think you've got some additional sort of thoughts.
Yeah, I love the idea of it being broad. I think in terms of how it compares to my last essay, I think it's definitely much more broad. I think micro is a good essay in terms of that broad aspect. I also think when you mentioned 2019, something interesting about that is that if I think back 5 years ago, that was also a time where micro was also under the microscope, so to speak, right? Because there was a lot of emphasis on what it actually wasn't doing, and perhaps the role that it could have been
because we saw productivity growth at the end of that decade dead, right?
Yeah.
There was real big calls for structural change,
exactly,
which is exactly what we're hearing again.
Yeah, and so that's what I'm saying. So I think you have the brief interruption with COVID. And so you have all these, macro trends that need to be dealt with first and foremost. But then it's almost like a synchronization of what the course is actually teaching you. Once you deal with the things in the macro, you go back and look at your underlying structural micro issues. And I think it would almost be a perfect metaphor for the course mirroring exactly what needs to happen in terms of real life. For us to have a micro essay here. Again, just some other things that Rowan already kind of spoke about. I think it catches out unprepared students. But for those who do prepare, it's beautiful.
It's conceptually not that difficult, actually, right?
No,
there's a lot to remember, but conceptually,
it's
not hard.
very straightforward. It's probably one of the most, honestly speaking, one of the most straightforward essays you can write in this course, because especially, like I said, I think they're going to keep it broad. I think it's going to be a choice of whatever kind of objectives you want to talk about, because they have done that before. Discuss how well micro achieves its objectives. And my other little reason for it is, as I said earlier in the shorts, it was almost teased as a question last year. So even though last year the short answer section was meant to be on the labour markets, there were 5 marks that specifically just said microeconomic reforms. And so I just think that, again, it's just something which they obviously do keep in mind, and they do want to test, and I think it'd be a great opportunity here.
Now, just a quick note, it wasn't the Catholic paper this year. They connected it to economic growth and inflation. So they went with some specific issues. I think both Terry and I have said, well, we think they're probably going to maybe open it up a bit more rather than connect it to specific issues. I think if they were to connect it to any issues, those issues probably make a lot of sense in terms of the 2 that you would pick, because it gives you the most flexibility in what policy you could then choose, right, to address it. I think they probably won't do unemployment if they do pick, even though they picked it in the past, partly because, we've had some labour market stuff essays not that long ago. And again, that really narrows it. It doesn't become a micro essay as much anymore.
Yeah, because there's certain parts of it that you can't really tie.
Yeah, exactly. So it becomes more of a labour market essay then, right? So I think the choice of objective, therefore, is one, if they do make it, that will keep it broad so you've got a bit of flexibility. So now we've got our final one, and this is where we've got some disagreement, actually.
Yeah, bit of friction.
Which will be great. Let's unpack it. So jump in, and I'd love to hear yours, Terry.
So my final one is, it kind of leads on with micro, because look, I will recognise I've got a bit of a bias here. I love the idea of like essays being foils of one another. So if I have a micro, I love to have it paired with a macro. Now, as we've seen in the past, they often don't do that, okay, which is fair enough. That's all good. And so I know Rowan has also himself split just thought that it's going to be of a split. I just look at this and I go, well, if I look at the first three essays that I've suggested, if just to remind you guys, it was the CAD and external stability, globalization and international organizations, and microeconomic reform. I always think that in the construction of an exam, just thinking in terms of the bands and kind of the standards that students meet to get into certain bands, when you look at the essay section, you've got to have, in my opinion, you usually need to have something that's fairly accessible. Yeah. Now, I look at those first three that I've picked and I go, you know what? I'm a bit of a I don't want to say this word. I'm just being a bit mean this year.
Yeah, so we are both, I think, being a little mean.
So I think there's room for us to have something a little bit more of a softball, a bit more of an easier one. And so for me, that one is just kind of a general kind of macro policy. Now, having said that, as I said, micro is going to, I think, if it is in there, it's going to be quite broad. But macro, as they usually do, needs to have a bit of a focus. So I've gone here with two objectives: macro on inflation and income distribution. Rowan has spoken as well when he did his split earlier that there is some interesting things that have been going on. I think the Catholic paper as well has said that when they've done their split, they've decided to go with these kind of objectives as well. So I've got inflation and income distribution. Last year was macro on economic growth and inflation, which was like that kind of slam dunk question, which almost everybody expected. So I don't think they're going to repeat the same objectives, but I just have a feeling in me that goes they're going to repeat that macro aspect. And as Rowan mentioned, I think they had done that.
They have done it once before. I think 2017 to 2018. So there is like a precedent for it happening. It's not likely, but there's a precedent, right? I would add, I mean, I have a different perspective, but I would add just, to support your point, Terry, for a moment, because I always think doing a macro essay in practice is just really good coverage, right? Yeah. Which I think you've got that point as well. Like, it just covers your bases, because then if you get a fiscal or a monetary, you're still okay for it, right? You've got stuff that you can say. So if you're really uncertain, particularly with the different picks that Terry and I, one I'm about to share, do a macro to cover your base, right? Essentially, because then if you get a specific one, you'll be fine, right? Yeah. But what I would say, the reason I think this is also really interesting is that arguably this year, like fiscal and monetary have not really been as aligned, right? As like you might want them to be, right? And they're often not the case, to be frank, because of the electoral influences, right, that play out for fiscal, that mean that fiscal policy will do some more, populist sort of policy outcomes, right? Whereas the RBA will go, well, we've just got to look at this purely on the objective. So my point there is that makes for a bit of analysis around like, okay, the macro policy mix actually, right? And who's pulling the weight and how are they going? So I would just add to that, like I actually think that's what makes it potentially quite interesting to do.
And I've also just spotted something as well in terms of to speak on what you were saying about that kind of conflict between the two policies, but also just looking at those objectives themselves as well. I think there's some interesting kind of interplay as well.
Definitely. Well, inflation impacts income distribution, right?
Exactly. So,
but they're also, like, how do you get them under control, right? Yeah. How do you deal with a cost of living crisis without driving inflationary pressure?
So
right?
it's not too late if you want to hop on the macro train.
Well, what I would say though is that the recent, again, this is a question of when the exam paper was written, as we've highlighted. A lot of this has only emerged post this recent budget, which came out in May, right? Because it was arguably a little conflicting, in terms of risks around inflationary pressure. So my hesitancy in saying, well, okay, is that it's probably become more of an issue after the paper was written. So, anyway, my take here is that, I said I thought inflation was going to be in the short. So this is, again, a question of like, we both agree on inflation.
It's going to be there, but
it's just where we think it's going to be, right? We have a bit of a difference there. Now, I have identified fiscal policy with unemployment and income distribution. So once again, we're both agreeing on income distribution featuring as an essay. The way it gets hit is a little bit different. Now, note, Terry had unemployment in the shorts. So once again, we've got unemployment, inflation, and income distribution we all agree on. Just where is it going to appear in the paper? So again, these are topics that we would be saying, go get your head around, right? Because we think it's going to be there. It's just we have a disagreement on exactly what part of the paper. Now, what's my rationale for fiscal with unemployment and distribution? Well, I've already shared a little bit about why I think there's a split, right, in fiscal and monetary. I'm not going to rehash that, right? Why I don't think it'll be a general macro as well is just because of the fact that I think there's only one example where they've done that, right, to sort of highlight what Terry's point was. Now, why do I think income distribution? Just to go a little specific here on the issues. Well, it was last assessed in 2022 as part of a labour market essay, and then in 21 there was a fiscal policy, unemployment, distribution of income, and external stability question. So the last time we've seen fiscal policy with income distribution was 2021. I think that's a big enough gap in time for what is, one, a big policy, fiscal policy, and two, a very big issue that has been very big as of an issue in Australia over the last couple of years, really, since COVID. So I feel like that makes it quite likely, right, in terms of why it's there. Now, I also think if you're looking, fiscal policy is pretty uniquely suited to dealing with unemployment and income distribution. So if you're also looking at, from a policy point of view, what can you say about the policy in relation to the issues? Well, there's a whole heap that you could say. So I also think that's one where they'd be trying to basically pair them to give you a lot that you could unpack. And I think there's also some interesting issues around, obviously there's a relationship between the level of unemployment and distribution of income. Obviously we've had low unemployment, but that's also why it makes some of the distribution of income stuff interesting, potentially. Now, this was in the Independent and Catholic papers. They did have, I think, a fiscal policy with an income distribution focus. I've added more of an unemployment addition to that as well. And look, I think, to your point, Terry, I agree, micro is maybe going to be difficult. I would expect for most students, you would hope that they could bang out a good fiscal policy essay, right? So, I think it's probably the easier of the two pairings as well,
definitely.
Right? Do you have any final comments on that conflict or any other sort of comments at all?
Yeah, I think to kind of resolve why I'm going with macro, and whereas the Independent Catholic have done the split, though, is I also tend to think of the Independent Catholic as they're more so trial papers, and at that stage of the course, unfortunately, most schools haven't actually finished the exam. So to kind of speak to my own point a little bit more, I just think that combining for macro to me makes a bit more sense when you consider the fact that they've probably split into fiscal and monetary,
and they might not have done monetary as much.
To kind of give that kind of cover, give that insurance that they haven't necessarily finished the whole course to that level of depth.
For sure. So look, let us know in the comments, right? Clearly, for the essays, there's been some overlap, but there's been some disagreement between the focus on external stability, right? And then certainly some disagreement around macro versus a specific fiscal. And then, inflation versus unemployment in the essays, or inflation versus unemployment in the short. So let us know, what do you agree with? What do you disagree with? As we said at the start of today, let us know what your teachers are saying, right? In terms of what they think. And maybe you've done your own analysis. Let us know what you think. Let's crowdsource this. Obviously, the goal here is to try to help as many of you prepare as effectively as you can so that you can knock the HSC Eco course and the final exam out of the park. If you have any other questions, of course, feel free to drop it in the comments. Any final comments from your end?
Yeah, I just want to know that, if any of you get bored enough, can you go and ask ChatGPT what the essay questions are going to be? Let us know what it is in the comments.
That would be pretty interesting, actually.
Pretty curious,
yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, plug ours in, or plug whatever in, and see what it comes up.
Maybe
with,
ask ChatGPT, are you Team Terry or are you Team Rowan? Who knows?
Awesome. Otherwise, we wish you all the best in the economics exam. We hope you nail it, and keep tuned for our post-exam review, because we'll be back with another episode then. See you all.
Take care.